My name is Amaka Nnaji. I am a PhD student in the Faculty of Agribusiness and Commerce, Lincoln University. I am here to make a presentation on my third paper, Influence of Risk Perception of Conflict on Farmers' Production Decisions, Evidence from Rural Nigeria. My supervisors are Dr. Nazmun Ratna, Professor Alan Renik, and Dr. Wanglin Ma. Before I go into the motivation for this study, I want to thank everybody here listening, and would like to so any suggestions on how to improve this paper would be greatly appreciated, as it's still a work in progress. So I'll start the presentation now. So for a background and motivation of the study, of recent, there's been an increase in climate change stressors, so rising temperatures, the bushfires in Australia, drought, flooding in India. And this has led to a massive migration of individuals to areas less affected. The resulting increase in developing population increase in these areas bring about more pressure and competition over scarce productive resources like land. So in most sub-Saharan African countries, we have what we call nomadic herding. Here, nomadic herders practice open grazing. They move with the animals from one point to the other in search of pasture. So in the rainy season, in terms of pasture abundance, they usually migrate northwards towards the Sahara Desert in search of pasture for the animals. And in the dry season, when there's lack of pasture, they migrate southwards towards the mangrove forest, grazing the animals. So of the recent increase in temperatures and resulting drought and desertification has led to a further migration southwards in search of pasture. So increased competition for land resources by crop farmers on one hand and herders on the other hand lead to what is called farmer-herder conflict. These conflicts are currently a serious problem in most of the developing world. They've led to loss of lives, property, and displacement of people. In 2018, 1,882 deaths and about 300,000 displaced people were recorded as a result of these types of conflicts in Nigeria alone. Considering more than half of rural dwellers are primarily involved in agricultural production, these types of conflicts definitely will have direct consequences for their livelihoods and well-being. And in the literature, there's been quite a bit of work on armed conflict, but not a lot of focus has been put into understanding, in particular, farmer-herdsmen conflict and how it influences rural households' livelihoods. So this study would focus on the risk perception of conflict, of farmer-herdsmen resources conflict, and how it influences rural households' production decisions. So for for related literature, as I mentioned earlier, of the recent increase in climate change stressors and the resulting increase in conflict as a result of that, there's been a lot of literature investigating the causes and effects of this conflict, of resources conflict. But in the case of Nigeria, there hasn't been a lot of research on farmer-herdsmen conflict and how it influences rural households and rural livelihoods. In the case of risk perception, you usually see a lot of research on assessing climate variability risks and how it influences agricultural production, but little or nothing on the effect of risk perception of farmer-herdsmen conflict on production decisions. So following the literature review, certain gaps were identified, definitely. So one, there's a lack of understanding of the dynamics of resources conflict, farmer-herdsmen conflict, and how it influences rural household production decisions. And secondly, to the best of my knowledge, this will be the first paper that attempts to determine the influence of the risk perception of farmer-herdsmen conflict on rural households production decisions. So this study asks the following question: to what extent does the risk perception of farmer-herdsmen resources conflict affect production decisions of rural households in Nigeria? So the study used Nigerian data. So in order to answer the research question, we developed a theoretical model of conflict by extending the classical farm household model by including a conflict shock variable in the form of the risk perception of farmer-herdsmen conflict. So here the model assumes that agricultural households, maximize utility over the consumption of goods and leisure, and subject to certain constraints, so production technology, time constraint, and income constraint. A model predicts that a shock in the form of risk perception of conflict would influence rural households' production decisions. So the households' first order conditions for optimality was derived by maximizing the Lagrangian expression over the consumption of goods and leisure, and minimizing it over the constraints. So based on the theoretical model developed, we make the following hypothesis. The risk perception of farmer-herdsmen conflict will reduce household decision to use and investment in productive inputs like fertilizers and pesticides. Moving on to empirical specification, binary logistic regression models were specified to determine the influence of the risk perception of farmer-herdsmen conflict on households' decision to use fertilizers and pesticides. Here, the dependent variable is a dummy that takes the value of 1 when households choose to adopt the use of fertilizers and pesticides, and the value of 0 otherwise. On the other hand, ordinarily square regression models was specified to determine the influence of the risk perception of conflict on households' investments in fertilizers and pesticides. So moving on to the study area and data. As I mentioned earlier, the study was carried out in Nigeria. Nigeria is a country in Western Africa. Primary data collected between May and June 2019 was used for this study. A multi-stage sampling technique was used to select households for this survey. In the first stage, zones, states, and local government areas were purposefully selected on the basis of a prior occurrence of farmer-herdsmen conflict in these areas. Also, preliminary analysis of secondary data was used to select zone, states, and local government areas. So the North Central was selected because it was found to be food secure and had the most occurrences of conflict. On the other hand, the Southeast zone was also selected because it was comparably food insecure with fewer occurrences of farmer-herdsmen conflict. In the second stage, towns, villages, and households were randomly selected, making a total of 401 households for the survey. Information collected was related to the 2018 planting season, and it focused on household head, and farm level characteristics. So these pictures are some of the pictures of the enumerators getting data from rural households. So moving on to constructing the risk perception index. Adapting the risk ranking method of DOS, Mark, Peak, and Barrett 2008, we construct the farmer-herdsmen conflict risk perception variable using the following ranking formula. So here, household heads were given a list of possible concerns as a result of farmer-herdsmen conflict, and they were told to choose the concerns they're worried about and rank in the order of worry, with 1 being the concern of greatest worry, and the last ranking could be from 2 to, as the case may be, to the end, as the case may be, being the order of least worry. So after that, a risk ranking index was derived for each concern using equation A, after which the risk ranking index for each household was summed up to derive an intensity measure of the perceived risk of farmer-herdsmen conflict for each household. Moving on. So table 1 gives a summary of the individual risk assessment index derived for the household. The second column here shows the number of households that shows each concern as that shows each concern as a worry for them. As you can see, danger to human life have the highest mean value. So it was and had about 390 households pick it as a worry. So it had the highest mean value, and it was followed closely by destruction of farmland and property, and physical insecurity and violent conflict. So table 2 gives a definition and summary statistics of dependent variables and key independent variable. So for the decision to adopt the use of fertilizers and pesticides, is a binary variable. So those variables, they're binary variables that take the value of 1 when households opt to use fertilizer and pesticides, and the value of 0 otherwise. For the dependent variables on expenditure on productive inputs, their variables are described as the household investment in fertilizers or pesticides per acre of cultivated land. Finally, for our constructed risk perception index of farmer-herdsmen conflict, it had a mean value of 4.08 and a range of between 0 to 5.67. So the higher the index, the risk perception index, the more risk the household perceives. Table 3 gives a definition and summary statistics of household head, and farm level control variables included in our model. Moving on. So moving on to the results. Table 4 here gives the estimation results for the influence of the risk perception of conflict on households' decision to adopt the use of fertilizers. And findings give a negative relationship. So it shows a negative relationship between the risk perception of conflict and the decision to use fertilizers. Specifically, a unit increase in the risk perception of farmer-herdsmen conflict was found to reduce the likelihood of households adopting use of fertilizers by 8.9%, and a unit increase in risk perception of conflict was also found to reduce the amount spent on fertilizers per acre of cultivated land by about 51.8%. Hence, we reject the null hypothesis that the risk perception of farmer-herdsmen conflict does not have an impact on rural households' decision to adopt fertilizers and expenditure on fertilizers. Moving on to table 5. So table 5 here gives the estimation results for the effect of risk perception of conflict on pesticide use. And the findings here show no significant impact, no significant effect of the risk perception of conflict on rural households' decision to adopt the use of fertilizers and their investment in fertilizers. So here we fail to reject the null hypothesis that the risk perception of farmer-herdsmen conflict does not have an impact on rural households' decision to adopt the use of fertilizers and invest in fertilizers. So in conclusion, our findings show that a unit increase in risk perception of farmer-herdsmen conflict reduces the likelihood of households adopting use of fertilizers by 8.9%, and the amount spent on fertilizer per acre of cultivated land by about 51.8%. Results also show no significant impact of the risk perception of farmer-herdsmen conflict on pesticide use and expenditure. So findings from this study will provide concrete evidence on the effect of farmer-herdsmen conflict on rural households, on rural dwellers and agricultural production, which hopefully will facilitate more efficient targeting of already existing initiatives to improve the agricultural sector. Also, findings would also facilitate policies that encourage more sustainable herding practices to curb the likelihood of these types of clashes, these types of conflict, farmer-herdsmen conflicts in the future. As the adverse effect of climate change is increasing, it appears to be increasing, and the only way to solve the problem would be to adopt strategies that mitigate its effect. Thank you for listening.